LG has some pretty big shoes to fill. The V10 was a beast of a camera phone, and now several manufacturers are playing with dual sensor setups. We've dug deep into our usual run of test setups, and it's time to take a closer look at the LG V20. Buckle up, folks, we have a lot of ground to cover, and I'm gonna move pretty quick. First, for you specs junkies, you can pause the video here to see what hardware we're working with. Now, with that out of the way, right off the bat, we're a bit disappointed in LG's auto image processing. The phone tends to veer a bit overexposed, and unlike previous LGs, the saturation seems to be bumped up a bit higher than we might like. Southern California has beautiful blue skies and warm afternoon light, but this blue is certainly exaggerated. The phone redeems itself on greens and earth tones, very accurately captured here, and yellows are stretched just to the clipping point, but we don't quite lose fine details in this flower. Unfortunately, where the V10 was fantastic at capturing reds, the extra saturation and exposure here pushes the V20 slightly away from the accuracy we used to enjoy. We can still see the difference between these blossoms better than on many other phones, but the V20 is starting to sizzle these warmer colors. Lastly, the phone does an excellent job metering for this white flower, and it's easy to see the details and the petals, which are just slightly off-white. Getting around the extra saturation, the phone does a very good job handling white balance. These photos look appropriately warm given the afternoon angle of the sun. Thankfully, in shade, the V20 doesn't seem to overcorrect often or push the shot too cold. Output is still consistent with the surrounding afternoon light. Looking at the photo files, JPEGs range from 3 to 11 megabytes in size, with most landing around 4. RAW files are just under 23 meg. Capturing RAW files is helpful as LG's JPEG compression can make your images kinda splotchy. Editing on your own will preserve fine details much better. Also, RAW gives you a safety net for those times you might over or underexpose. Walking back an image, even 2 whole stops, we can still recover quite a bit of info. We've covered the app layout in a separate video, and this is still one of our favorite phone camera layouts. It's a shame that some features, like the simple capture mode, are buried in settings, but with a focus on manual controls and options, the V20 camera app is easily one of the best for people of all skill levels. Our biggest complaint has to do with the second screen ticker display. In the camera app, this holds shortcuts to your 3 main modes. But if while you're shooting you get notifications, you can't switch modes until this screen clears them. We don't remember the V10 hijacking camera options like this. Now, looking at the zoom, LG is continuing the dual sensor experiment from the G5. Instead of Apple's second sensor zoom, we get an ultra-wide view. It's well integrated into the zoom range, but there is a bit more of a pop when you transfer from the normal view to the wide. This wide-angle shooter is fun to play with, but there is quite a bit of barrel distortion. You'll want to keep your horizon near the middle of the frame, and watch how it pulls into a smile as we move the ground lower. The smaller sensor and aperture on this wide-angle shooter means night shots will be darker and grainier. As for the practicality of this hardware, I likely wouldn't use this for any professional output, but for my own family photos and videos, wide-angle shots have proven more useful chasing our daughter around than zooming in. Your mileage will of course vary. Speaking of zooming in, the V20 only has a software crop zoom. At full reach, we get an overly sharpened mess. But somewhere around half the zoom range, the camera still has enough resolution to play with from the sensor to deliver some pretty clean-looking results. On paper, the V20 sensor is slightly smaller than the V10, but the change in aspect ratio seems to have made up some of the surface area discrepancy when looking at macro shots. Both have nearly the same minimum focusing distance, almost tying the Galaxy S7 for getting up close, and the background blur is nearly identical. You can achieve some really pretty bokeh from the main camera, and you'll only see the Samsung pull ahead when you zoom in really close. Even when pixel peeping, it's tough to see practical differences. Now, no one is catching up to Samsung this year for focusing speed, but the V20 remains sure-footed and accurate. We rarely faced problems with misfocusing, and the app was responsive, trying to shift focus quickly between these two objects. The only issue seems to be the extra focus pull we see when moving focus farther. The phone will overshoot and roll back in, which makes this a little less useful for folks who might want to rack focus between two subjects. The Achilles heel for LGs has always been the lens quality, and the V20 only subtly improves on that issue. This glass is still quite prone to fringing, flaring, ghosting, and small distortions. This is most noticeable when cropping, and it's markedly better than the G5, but we'd still like to see a little more improvement moving forward. But we are happy to see noticeable improvements in HDR output. Even though the phone is still prone to overexposing, the multiple exposure processing does a much better job of preventing clipped highlights, and will more consistently balance shadow detail against brighter areas of the frame. LG hasn't quite caught Apple or Google here, but this is much more useful output. Okay, so you can shoot panoramas from the ultra-wide camera, but you probably shouldn't. It's just too wide to stitch together properly. Panoramas from the main camera are solid, if a bit mid-pack. No really egregious stitching errors, but some transitions are still a bit more abrupt than several flagship competitors. Now, spending a little time with the selfie shooter, and I still hate selfies, LG only has one front-facing camera on this V, which seems to be another ultra-wide, which can be cropped in for a more normal field of view. Expect most shots to be a bit overexposed, and video is somewhat poor. Oddly, we're seeing dropped frames and quite a bit of rolling shutter jello. At least we have this great Odo mode, beauty mode, to turn you into a horrific plastic mess of a mannequin. Looking at nighttime performance, this camera is a solid low-light option. The optical image stabilization works really well for stills, and I was able to consistently pull off handheld shots at night down to 1/5 of a second when trying to hold steady. Left up to the app though, again, there's a consistent tendency to overexpose, which means jacking up the ISO noise much higher than we need to. Dialing back a half to a full stop depending on lighting can help a lot in preserving image integrity. The V20 almost nails our creepy gate. Output is just a little cooler than the scene looks like in real life. And shooting auto, I wasn't able to get a clean shot of this flower in almost no light, but manually setting the shutter and ISO, we end up with a much sharper image, which can then be brightened a little for an overall better effect. And I always have to show off that manual controls allow for some fun effects like long exposures of streaking taillights. You can't do this with an iPhone or a Pixel out of the box. Moving over to video, the V20 captures a shockingly high bitrate at maximum settings, which eats around 460 megabytes of storage per minute. And the color processing doesn't seem to be quite as aggressive as when compared to shooting still photos. From the main camera, we see few compression artifacts molesting the uniform blue of the sky, but switch to the wide camera in the afternoon and the noise is somewhat distracting. Overall, we're treated to some terrific video, but this camera really wants you to control the scene by adjusting the manual settings. It's actually pretty easy to work this footage into projects. Somewhere around 70% of my iPhone coverage was shot from a V20, as was our entire Axon 7 Mini unboxing. The big benefit is shutter speed control, where you can properly lock exposure like you can for stills. Like on this water scene, cranking the shutter up to 1/4000th of a second, we get this razor-sharp water spray in every frame of footage. Slowing that shutter down to 1/80th of a second, and using my cheap sunglasses as a filter, we see how much blurrier each frame is. Being able to control not only white balance, but really dialing in specific exposure settings makes this an excellent companion camera to a proper mirrorless production setup. But the story on stabilization will likely disappoint some who were curious about this phone. The V20 is better than the V10, and LG has reined in some of the jello wobble of last year's phone. Using only optical image stabilization while walking, there's still plenty of sway, but it's not as seasick-inducing. Switching down to HD recording means we can use software stabilization to help, but the final output is still a fair bit twitchier than what Google or Apple is currently supplying. Also, it was fairly uncommon and impossible to predict, but for a couple shots, while trying to hold still, the hardware stabilization started acting up and getting a little funky. Out of over 20 gigabytes worth of files, this affected 3 very short clips. And what would good video be without good audio? The V20 continues LG's improvements, utilizing a 3-microphone array which can be tuned directionally, and adds a low-cut filter to help reduce rumble, and a limiter which can be used as a safety net against sudden loud spikes in your recordings. Also new for the camera app when shooting, the audio mode not only delivers meters, you get a proper waveform of the audio being captured. This is incredibly handy for monitoring your results. Now an exposure test moving from dark to bright and back, the V20 handles changes in light fairly well, making even-handed adjustments and subtle white balance shifts, none of which are jarring. It's returning to dark that we see some shutter speed adjustments that give off a buzzy quality, but overall this is better than most flagship phones and is a nice improvement over the LG V10. Unfortunately, slow motion is still kind of a mess. 120 frame per second 720p really shouldn't be this taxing, but we still see dropped frames and the final edited output from this phone is pretty blurry with abrupt transitions moving from real-time to slow-mo. LG still has a lot of work to do here. Lastly, there are some fun features using the multi-camera setup. The pop-out feature will use the wide-angle camera as a backdrop for the main camera, creating an interesting shadow box effect. You can also create easy collages directly from the app using all three cameras, but these are only saved at the resolution of the phone's screen. It's fun working directly from the cameras in the moment, but standalone apps to create a collage might deliver higher quality results. So let's wrap this up. Where's that leave us with the cameras on the LG V20? It's overly simplistic to say this phone is only for people who like adjusting manual settings. For the most part, images delivered under full auto are very good, if falling shy of the excellent auto photos we get from a Galaxy S7, or the extremely consistent image processing we find on iPhones. Slow motion video landing as the only truly unusable aspect of the V20. What this phone has that few others can match is as broad a scope, embracing photographers of all skill levels. No one else really seems interested in offering a simple mode anymore. Even if LG buried it this year, it's still in the app. Many phones will hold your hand through auto modes, but few will grow with you as well, moving through intermediate and advanced photography concepts. It is true that this camera comes to life once you start adjusting a few settings on your own, instead of leaving every aspect up to a computer, but that's pretty much true of all cameras. We might grin at that friend who brags about their nice camera, but only shoots in green box mode. The V20 might ask for your input, but it rewards you for participating in the process of making your own photos and videos. While I have a lot of fun with this camera personally, I've never used a phone camera or microphones which could as seamlessly blend into my actual work. I don't claim to be any great cinematographer, but seeing not a single comment that there was anything different or distracting about this footage compared to how I normally shoot, well, that was very encouraging. The V20 easily fulfilling a role I could never count on a Samsung, Pixel, or iPhone to achieve. As always, thanks so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe to this channel for more reviews like these, and check out our previous real camera reviews to see how the V20 stacks up to the competition. For Pocket Now, I'm Juan Carlos Bagnell, some gadget guy on Twitter and Instagram, and I will catch you all on the next review.